Welcome to this session of Environment and Ecology, uh, conducted by EduBridge IS. This is lecture number 3, and we will be discussing about the remaining functions of ecosystem. So just a minute. Okay. So yesterday we discussed about ecosystem, and under that we talked about various components or a structure of ecosystem. There we discussed about biotic components and abiotic components. Then we started discussion of functions of ecosystem. And in the functions of ecosystem, we have discussed about the energy flow. That is the most important function of an ecosystem, right? And we also discussed about certain related concepts to energy flow, like we have discussed about the trophic levels, various ecological pyramids we have discussed, and also we have talked about the productivity, ecological productivity in the form of GPP, that means gross primary productivity, NPP, net primary productivity, and secondary productivity we have discussed. So let me discuss few more concepts related to productivity itself. So generally, we may think that the larger the size of a tree, it would be more productive, right? So generally, obviously, for an ecosystem, the productivity depends upon the producers or the type of producers that that particular ecosystem have, right? And if producers are the main components of the primary productivity or primary production, then obviously we may think that larger the size of producers, larger will be the productivity. But that is not the case, right? So you can read the point number 3, but it does not mean that large size trees with dense population does not necessarily mean that the forest would be more efficient in terms of primary production than a pond with small size producers like phytoplanktons. So it is not that the size of the primary or the producers will influence the productivity of a particular ecosystem. No, it does not depend on the size. Then what is the factor on which the productivity depends? It depends upon how efficiently a particular producer in an ecosystem or a particular ecosystem itself is using the radiant energy. That means the energy in the form of sunlight. How efficiently an ecosystem uses that energy will make that particular ecosystem more productive than others, right? So it is about the use of radiant energy in the form of sunlight, right? Next. So that is the size of producer is not related with the efficiency, fine. Rather, it is dependent on the rate of fixation of radiant energy in an ecosystem. So it all depends upon the rate of fixation, how efficiently that particular ecosystem is fixing the radiant energy in the form of sunlight. That is more important to determine the productivity of an ecosystem. Next, apart from sunlight, we also know that if only sunlight is the factor that determines the productivity, then we may or we can say that okay, deserts will be more productive. But it is not the case again. Apart from the sunlight, other factors should also be there, like precipitation and availability of nutrients. And this availability of nutrients is more important for aquatic ecosystems, fine. So once we discuss about biomes, we will also discuss about aquatic ecosystem. There you will come to know that okay, apart from the sunlight, for a particular aquatic ecosystem, the availability of nutrients is also important in order to determine the productivity of that particular ecosystem, right? So nutrients is a factor that determines the productivity or that influence the productivity of aquatic ecosystem. Fine. Now let us discuss few ecosystems in the order of uh, decreasing productivity, or the most productive ecosystems are in the beginning, and thereon the productivity goes on decreasing. So swamps and marshes. So these are you can say wetlands. Swamps and marshes are the wetlands, and their productivity is more than other ecosystems. So swamps and marshes, tropical rainforests and estuaries, they have almost similar productivity, and they are the most productive ecosystems that we have in the environment. Swamp marshes, tropical rainforests and estuaries, right? Followed by temperate forest, followed by temperate forest, then taiga, taiga forest, and finally savanna. So these are the most productive ecosystems that we have. Fine. So though these names are not familiar with you, I know we have not discussed about biomes, but just to uh, give you information about the most productive ecosystem, I'm just mentioning these names. We will discuss in detail about these biomes or these ecosystems in our next lectures. Fine. So don't worry, though these names are not familiar with you, you should not worry. We will discuss these names in our subsequent lectures. Fine. So these are the most productive ecosystems. Then least productive ecosystems. So least productive ecosystem, deserts, obviously deserts, they are least productive of all the ecosystems. Then tundra. Tundra is also least productive ecosystem. Tundra is an ecosystem, or it is a biome which is at the subpolar location. That means from 70° to 80° north in northern hemisphere, tundra biome or tundra ecosystem is there, and they are less productive. Why they are less productive? Because the availability of snowfall is there, but the sunlight is not available for most part of the year. It is available only during summers, and that's why tundra is also least productive ecosystem. Fine. Then open oceans. So open oceans, why we are considering open oceans as less productive? Because as I have discussed, or as we have discussed, nutrient is the factor which determines productivity of aquatic ecosystem, and generally nutrients are available through the wash of through the water that is coming from the land or from the terrestrial ecosystem. So for open ocean, it is very difficult to have a nutrient content. Why? Because its contact with land is not there, and that's why it is deprived of nutrients. Fine. So open ocean means that part of ocean which is quite deep. I'm excluding continental shelf and also obviously continental slope. Fine. So continental slope and shelf are excluded, and leftover part of ocean floor, that part is less productive. Though the area occupied by that particular part is more, it is less productive than other ecosystems. Fine. I am not factoring in area here. Area of open ocean is not factored in. It is the point which we'll discuss as our next point. So open oceans are less productive. Then continental shelves. Continental shelves are also less productive, but they are more productive than open ocean, because continental shelf may have the access to nutrients that is coming from land. Then lakes and streams. Lakes and streams are less productive than these ecosystem. And finally, temperate grasslands. Fine. Temperate grasslands, you can say they are sorry. temperate grasslands are more productive than all these ecosystem that you are seeing on your screen as point number 1. Fine. Temperate grasslands like steppes, prairies. We will discuss about steppes, prairies as a temperate grasslands in our discussion of biomes. Fine. So I hope this is clear. These are the least productive ecosystem, and desert is the least amongst all of them. Fine. Now, if we factor in area, if we consider area of an ecosystem, and then if we try to analyze the productivity of an ecosystem, then we can say that the open oceans are most productive. Why? Because the area covered by open ocean is largest area on this planet, right? They have the largest area, and that's why the productivity of the open ocean, if we consider or if we take into account the area, is more than any ecosystem in the world. Fine. I hope this point is clear to you. Fine. So this is about the productivity of different ecosystems. Now, next. So let us come back to our discussion of functions of ecosystem. So we have yesterday discussed about one function of ecosystem, that is energy flow. Now we will be discussing about second important function of ecosystem, that is biogeochemical cycles, which are also called as nutrient cycles. Fine. So let us discuss nutrient cycles. So nutrient cycles, they are also, you can say, closely related to energy flow, because nutrient flow also occurs through trophic level, but it is not only restricted to trophic levels. Why? Because trophic levels are for biotic component of the environment, right? So nutrient cycles are not only associated with biotic components, they also have their relationship with abiotic components. Fine. So though they are parallel to energy flow, we also should take into account the relationship of nutrients with abiotic components, because most of the nutrients that biotic components receive, they are received from abiotic components like soil or atmosphere. Fine. Next, so energy flow is driven by an endless solar power. So this is also a very important point. Energy flow of trophic levels, or energy flow amongst trophic level, is derived by endless solar power. There is no limit to solar power that we can use, or the amount that we receive from solar from sun. Only 0.02% of that power is used for photosynthesis. Right? So that is endless power. But that is not the case with nutrient cycle, or that is not the case with nutrients. Nutrients are limited. Nutrients are not imported nor exported from earth. They are there in the soil or in the atmosphere, and those nutrients should be recycled time and again in order to use them. And that's why you can say that the nutrient cycle is a closed cycle. It is not an open cycle, it is a closed cycle. Fine. And last point, and therefore movement of nutrient material is in cyclic manner. As it is limited, as these nutrients are limited, we should ensure that the flow or the amount of nutrient that is used by biotic components, that should be recycled back into the nature. Fine. And that's why nutrient cycles are in the form of cyclic manner. Next is that is the mineral elements taken by green plants are again returned to the environment. So these nutrients should be returned to the environment in order to make sure that the nutrients are refilled into environment and they are used by next generations of biotic components. So in this process, why it is called as biogeochemical cycle? Because it involves bio, that means life. Organisms are involved. Geo, that means it involves rocks or soil. And also, as these are chemical, there are many chemical reactions which make available these nutrients to biotic components. That's why it involves uh, biological cycle or biological component, geological component, and chemical components, and that's why it is known as biogeochemical cycle. Please check your mic, please. Shashank, kindly check your mic. Shashank. Yeah. Fine. So that's why they are called as biogeochemical cycles. Fine. And most of these cycles are atmospheric cycles. So the essential nutrients like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, they are taken up by biotic components, especially plants, through atmosphere. Also, there are cycles like nitrogen cycle, which have both the components. That means atmospheric phase also, and the phase associated with soil also. And lastly, there are certain nutrients which are again essential nutrients like phosphorus and sulfur. They are available majorly through soil. That means they do not have atmospheric cycles. They do not have atmospheric phases. They only have sedimentary cycles. Fine. And whenever we talk about sedimentary cycles, we should also take into account how those nutrients are made available to biotic components. For sedimentary cycle, those nutrients are made available to biotic component through the process of weathering or mining. And as those nutrients are weathered or mined from the soil or rocks, part of it is washed away into the oceans, and it gets accumulated in the ocean floor. And that particular part of those sediments like phosphorus or sulfur, it will be washed off, or it will not be available for the use of plants or animals. And that's why these sedimentary cycles, or the cycles associated with phosphorus and sulfur, they are called as imperfect cycles. Why? Because the part of these nutrients is not made available to the biotic components. But it is not the case with nitrogen or oxygen or carbon. The recycling of these gases, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, is very fast, and that's why these gaseous components or these gaseous cycles are called as perfect nutrient cycles. Fine. So there are two types of cycles that we should learn. First is atmospheric cycles and sedimentary cycles, or uh, uh, the cycles or the nutrients which are cycled through rock or sediments. And out of these two, atmospheric cycles are referred to as perfect cycles, and sedimentary cycles are referred to as imperfect cycles. Let us discuss these cycles here. His mic is there. Shashank, your mic is still. Shashank, kindly switch off your mic, please. Okay, fine. So let us discuss these cycles now. So first is water cycle. So see, these cycles are not very important. At least you can say this for a water cycle and carbon cycle. But there are cycles like nitrogen. Nitrogen cycle is important for our discussion. So we'll briefly discuss these cycles, starting with water cycle. So water cycle, you can see the most important processes that are uh, carried out during water cycle are evaporation or evapotranspiration, then uh, condensation, precipitation, and percolation. Fine. So let us discuss water cycle. You can see on your screen there are different processes that are involved in water cycle, like evaporation. So evaporation, then evapotranspiration. That means the evaporation of water through plants or through the canopies of plants. Then condensation, as this water is evaporated in the form of water vapor, it is condensed. Then precipitation, the condensed form of water comes down again on the surface of earth as rainfall or snowfall. And finally, the excessive amount of precipitation is percolated in the ground as groundwater. Fine. So these are the four processes which are important for water cycle. And what is water cycle? Water cycle is a continuous circulation of water in the earth atmosphere system, driven by solar energy. This is important, driven by solar energy. Fine. And these are the four processes which are important in water cycle. Next. Next is carbon cycle. Carbon cycle. And what are the important processes through which carbon is made available to organisms, or how that carbon is removed from organisms and it is again refilled or replenished in the environment. So those processes are in the form of photosynthesis. Through photosynthesis, plants use atmospheric CO2 directly for making or for converting solar energy into chemical energy in order to prepare their own food. So that is photosynthesis. Then through photosynthesis, as solar energy is converted into chemical energy, that energy can be transferred to other consumers, and that those consumers, through respiration, they give back the CO2 in the atmosphere. So photosynthesis is the process with which CO2 is taken up. Respiration, through respiration, CO2 is removed. Apart from these two well-known processes, there are other processes like decomposition. Through decomposition, once these plants and animals they die, microorganisms act on those dead material, and CO2 is released during the process of decomposition. So during the process of decomposition, CO2 is released back into the atmosphere. Fine. So photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition. Apart from this, fossilization is also a process which converts the plant material, or which converts the living organisms into fossil fuels, and those fossil fuels can again be used through combustion, and through combustion of these fossil fuels, CO2 is again given back into the atmosphere. Right. So total 5 processes. First, photosynthesis. Second, respiration. Third, decomposition. fourth fossilization, and fifth combustion, right? So these are the processes associated with carbon cycle. But as you all know, the last process of combustion is what we say is excessively used by human beings, and that's why the balance of carbon cycle is decreasing. Carbon dioxide is present naturally in the environment, but with the uh, more use of fossil fuels, we are adding more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Fine. And that is leading to global warming, which we will study under climate change. Next now. So these two cycles were not very important, but now nitrogen cycle is very important. Fine. So though this is not very clear, let me explain this. So we all know that nitrogen is available in the nature, and it is nearly 79% of all atmospheric gases. But this form of nitrogen cannot be used by plants or organisms directly, and that's why it has to be converted into ammonia or nitrates or nitrites, so that plant species can use that particular form of nitrogen, and through plant species that nitrogen is made available to consumers or animals. Fine. So atmospheric nitrogen is made available to plants through the process of nitrogen fixation, and there are a number of ways through which nitrogen fixation can occur. Naturally, nitrogen fixation can occur through lightning or thunder. So the first important process of fixation of nitrogen is lightning or thunder. Fine. So during lightning or thunder, the nitrogen molecule is broken up, and that broken up molecule of nitrogen subsequently is made available to the plant species. Fine. So first process of nitrogen fixation is, as you can see here, is atmospheric fixation through lightning, combustion, or even volcanic activities. Yes, even volcanic activities, we know that through volcanic activities, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide are released. So first process for nitrogen fixation is atmospheric fixation, and that occurs through lightning, combustion, and volcanic activities. Then second form of or second process of nitrogen fixation is through bacterial activities. So we have discussed about symbiotic association of rhizobium and leguminous plants. So through symbiotic bacteria like rhizobium, we can make available atmospheric nitrogen to the plants. Right? Apart from these symbiotic bacteria like rhizobium, there are certain free living bacteria like azotobacter, cyanobacteria. They also can fix atmospheric nitrogen, and they can convert that nitrogen into ammonia. And ammonia is the form of nitrogen which can be used up by different plant species. So even free living bacteria can carry out nitrogen fixation. Next, so atmospheric fixation, bacterial fixation. Next is nitrification. So there are certain species of plants which cannot use ammonia directly, and for them there are certain microorganisms in the form of nitrosomonas or nitrococcus bacteria, which will convert this ammonia fixed by bacteria like azotobacter or rhizobium into nitrates or nitrites. So there are these nitrifying bacteria like nitrosomonas or nitrococcus, which convert ammonia into nitrates or nitrites. Fine. And that form of nitrogen in the form of nitrates or nitrites is used by then plant species. Also, we have a bacteria called as nitrobacter, which converts nitrates into nitrites. Fine. So nitrobacter is a bacteria which converts nitrates into nitrites. So again, it can be used by different plant species. Fine. So these are the processes through which nitrogen is made available to plants. Fine. So plants can use these forms of nitrogens, either ammonia or nitrates or nitrites, and the process of assimilation is carried out, through which this nitrogen is used up by plants for the manufacturing of proteins, DNAs, or RNAs. So through assimilation, nitrogen is converted into organic molecules such as proteins, DNA, RNA, etc. These molecules make the plant and animal tissue. Fine. So nitrification is a necessary for every plant, or it can be skipped for some. It can be skipped for some. There are certain plants which can directly use ammonia, and they don't need nitrogen in the form of nitrates or nitrates. Fine. So it is not necessary that nitrogen should be available as nitrates or nitrites only. Fine. So these are the processes through which nitrogen is made available. But as it is made available and as it is used by plant species, it should be given back into atmosphere, right? And that's why there are processes like ammonification. So what happens in ammonification? So there are certain bacteria which are called as ammonifying bacteria like Pseudomonas, and these bacteria, they act upon excreted material, uric acid or urea, or they act upon dead materials or dead organic matter to release nitrogen, or to uh, release nitrogen to the soil as ammonia, right? So the content or the nitrogen that is present in the bodies of these organic matter, that is released back into soil in the form of ammonia. Fine. Apart from ammonification, which allows ammonia to be released into the soil, there are certain bacteria which are called as denitrifying bacteria. These denitrifying bacteria convert nitrates back into the gaseous nitrogen. Denitrifying bacteria, what they do, they convert nitrates back into the gaseous nitrogen. Fine. So denitrification is a reverse of nitrogen fixation. So there can be a specific question: which of the following is the reverse of nitrogen fixation process? So it is denitrification. Fine. Not ammonification, because in ammonification the nitrogen compounds are not released as atmospheric or gaseous nitrogen. It is released as ammonia. And it is carried out by denitrification is carried out by bacteria like Pseudomonas denitrificans. Next, apart from these natural processes, there are industrial activities also. For example, we have fertilizer factories. So fertilizer factories under high pressure and high temperature conditions, they break the nitrogen molecule into atomic nitrogen, which can be combined with hydrogen to form ammonia, NH3. Right? So in industrial activities, we can make ammonia, which is the form that can be used by plants, and that is nothing but a fertilizer. Fine. So these are the processes through which nitrogen can be made available to plants or different organisms, and also it can be subsequently released back into the atmosphere or in the environment. One more important point which I want to make is that, see, though we are saying that these nutrient cycles are cyclical in nature, that means whatever uh, nutrients organisms are using, that is again replenished into the environment. Fine, but it is not that, okay, suppose 100 grams of nitrogen is used by all the plants and organisms, then 100 grams is again released back. No, it is not the case. It is not the case. There will be certain amount of nutrients which will be lost in the process. Fine. Next is phosphorus cycle. So till now, the cycles that we have discussed, like nitrogen, carbon, or water, they majorly depend on gaseous cycle, or they are majorly gaseous cycles. But phosphorus is available in the rocks or in the soil, and in order to make that phosphorus from soil or from rocks to be used up by organisms, we need the help of weathering activity. So through weathering or through mining activities, this phosphorus can be made available, or it can enter into soil or water. Fine. So from sediments, how it can enter into soil or water? Through weathering or mining activities. And as it is entering into soil or water, if suppose there is a torrential rainfall, then part of this phosphorus in soil or water will be washed away into oceans, and it will be subsequently settled into or at ocean floor. And as it is settled on ocean floors are not exposed to any kind of weathering medium, like wind, water, waves. It is not exposed to these kind of weathering mediums, and that's why that particular amount to be again used by organisms, it will take time. And that's why these cycles are referred to as imperfect nutrient cycles, because the amount of nutrients which is washed away into the oceans and which is settled at the ocean floor will take certain time to be used up by organisms again, or to be made available for organisms again. Fine. So once weathering happens and once phosphorus enters into soil and water, then it is a very similar process. The plants use this phosphorus through assimilation, and then through plants it is made available to consumers. Fine. And for what purpose phosphorus is used? Phosphorus is an important part of DNA and RNA biological membranes, and also of bones and teeth. Fine. How it is released back into the environment? Again, through decomposition. So through decomposition of plants and consumers, phosphorus is partly released back into the environment. Why partly? Because part of it is in the oceans. Fine. Next is sulfur cycle. So sulfur cycle again is very similar to phosphorus cycle. Sulfur cycle is again very similar to phosphorus cycle, because sulfur is available in the rocks and soil in the form of sulfate, sulfides, and organic sulfur. It is released through the process of weathering and erosion, or even mining activities. But apart from, as it is released from weathering and or erosion, it will be made available to plants and subsequently to consumers. But apart from this sedimentary cycle, even sulfur has a gaseous component. Sulfur cycle has a gaseous phase, you can say. And we all know that there are certain atmospheric or natural processes like volcanic activities or bacterial processes through which sulfur is released into the atmosphere as a gaseous form of sulfur. So through natural activities, sulfur is made available to different organisms. But apart from natural activities, the burning up of fossil fuel by human beings or certain industrial activities like aluminum industries, they release sulfur. Fine. So this sulfur or this atmospheric sulfur released by natural processes or man-made or human processes, that sulfur will come down through the rainfall as weak sulfuric acid, and that rainfall is nothing but acid rain. Fine. So how this released or artificially released sulfur gas is used up by plants? It come down with rain as weak sulfuric acid, and it gets mixed up with the soil, and through soil it can be used up by plants or consumers. Fine. So this is about the nutrient cycles. Fine. Only important cycle you can say is nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen cycle is important, and you can study also, means you can say that even phosphorus and sulfur cycles are bit important, but majorly it is a nitrogen cycle. Fine. Next is ecological succession. So it should be number 3. Kindly give number 3 to this ecological succession. So what is ecological succession? So ecological succession is the process by which communities of plants and animals in an area are replaced or changed over a period of time. Fine. So see, biotic component of the ecosystem is not constant. It is extremely dynamic component. We know the process of species formation and also species extinction, right? If there are certain species which are not able to adjust with their environment, or if their habitat has been destroyed by natural or human activities, then those species will be wiped out from that particular habitat, and their place will be taken by new species. Right. So this process in which biotic components are changed or replaced over a period of time is called as ecological succession. Fine. And ecological succession uh, ecological succession uh, can occur because of natural processes, or even because of man-made activities also, or because of artificial processes also. Fine. So let us read point number 2. Both the biotic and abiotic components are involved in this change. So it is not that only the abiotic components are leading to destruction of biotic components. Even biotic components, we are a biotic component of the environment. Our activities are also leading to this change in the species, and that's why we can say that biotic as well as abiotic components lead to ecological succession. Right. This change is brought about both by activities of communities as well as by the physical environment in that particular area. So suppose a physical environment is becoming less suitable for the population of different species, then those species might not be able to live in that particular area, and subsequently they will be replaced by certain other species. Fine. So it is abiotic components also and biotic components also. That means, suppose if there is excessive feeding of a larger species which is feeding on smaller species, so eventually that smaller species may go extinct because of excessive exploitation of that smaller species. Fine. So it is both biotic and abiotic components which lead to ecological succession. Fine. So there is question, sir, how abiotic component is involved? Abiotic component, suppose climate, we have discussed climate as abiotic component. So suppose climate is not suitable for the particular species, then obviously it will go extinct after certain generations, right? And eventually it will be replaced by certain other species. Right? That's why abiotic components are also important, or they are also playing their role in ecological succession. Right? Next. So primarily there are two types of successions. First is primary succession and second is secondary succession. So what is primary succession? So I have not made slides for this particular topic. If you want to write, please write. So primary succession is the succession which occurs on entirely new habitat. Which occurs on entirely new habitat. Suppose if there is a water body, and or suppose if there is a any particular land which was there in the center of the ocean, and because of certain activities the water has receded and that land is now exposed. So that is a completely new habitat, and if a succession, if the species are occurring on that particular new habitat, then we can say that it is a primary succession. Fine. So primary succession occurs on entirely new habitat. Fine. Next point. That is, it occurs on a lifeless habitat. So there should not be any life before primary succession on that particular habitat. It occurs on a lifeless habitat. Now, you can make flowchart, means the next point that we'll be discussing, you can write it in the form of flowchart. So first point you can write, firstly, a pioneer species. Firstly, a pioneer, P-I-O-N-E-R, pioneer species like lichens or microbes occur. Right? So these pioneer species are certain species which can survive into harsh habitat. They don't need any favorable conditions and they can survive into harsh habitat. Yesterday, while discussing, in the first lecture, while discussing, we have referred to lichens. And there I have discussed that lichens are the kind of vegetation that we find in tundra region, right? And in tundra, conditions are harsh conditions. So even in those harsh conditions, these kind of vegetation occur. Right? So pioneer species like lichens or microbes occur. Next arrow you can give, and next or second point of that particular flowchart, they alter habitat conditions. They alter habitat conditions. So how they alter habitat conditions? Through excretion or through the decomposition of these microbes or lichens, the nutrients are released into the soil, and thereby soil is made more fertile. And that's why we can say that it is more favorable environment, or it is more favorable habitat for subsequent species of organisms. Their own decomposition. See, suppose if there are microbes, and yes, suppose microbes are there or lichens are there, and lichens are not able to find their food material, subsequently they die, and those lichens will be acted upon by other microbes. Fine. So their own decomposition they can carry. Next, third point. Habitat will become more diverse. Third arrow or third point under this particular flowchart. Habitat will become more diverse with the occurrence of new organisms. With the occurrence of new organisms. Next arrow. So now I'll be using one word, one very specific word. We have not discussed that particular word, but still you write, because once we are done with primary succession, we will discuss that particular word. Fine. So next point you can write, new niche opportunities are created. NICHE. New niche opportunities are created. So what is niche? Niche is nothing but a functional role played by a particular species in that particular environment. It is the functional role. For example, microbes, they have the role of decomposition of the organic matter, right? So as environment or as habitat is becoming more favorable, there may be different species which will have to play different role in that particular habitat, right? And as it is a lifeless habitat, as it is developing or as it is inhabited by new species of animals, we can say that new niche opportunities for those species will be developed. Right? So that means those species will have to play certain kind of role in that particular habitat, or they will occupy a particular role in that particular habitat, and through their activities, the conditions will even be made superior for subsequent species. Next arrow you can write, over the period of time, habitat conditions change. Habitat conditions change and pioneer species disappear. And pioneer species disappear. And last arrow, when certain stability is reached, when certain stability is reached, a climax community is developed. Climax community is developed. Fine. So what is climax community? So in bracket you can write final stage in the succession. Fine. But it is not that it will be the final species that has occurred. No, we have discussed that conditions, as conditions keep on changing, new species will continue to occur. But for example, we call grasslands as grasslands because their grasslands are available in more number. That means the climate has been or the climate is suitable of means climate of that particular habitat is suitable for grassland, but it is not that in future climate will not change, and it is not that grasses will not, or grasses will not be wiped out from that particular habitat, right? So in future it may change, but it obviously will take certain amount of time. So even primary succession from development of a particular lifeless habitat through pioneer species and to reach up to the climax community, it takes time. But once it achieves certain stability, we can say that, okay, primary succession has been completed and climax community has developed. But it is not that climax community will remain static. It will change in future. Right? And what is pioneer species? Pioneer species is the first species to colonize a lifeless habitat. So if you want to mention under first point of your flowchart, you can mention pioneer species is the first species to colonize a lifeless habitat. Fine. Now, so I hope primary succession is clear. Primary succession is a type of ecological succession which occurs on a lifeless habitat. A barren land or barren habitat is there, and that is being colonized by pioneer species, and eventually it leads way to climax community. Now, secondary succession. So what is secondary succession? It is a succession that occurs in an area. It occurs in an area where a complete or partial destruction of existing community has occurred due to natural or man-made reasons. Fine. So what does that mean? It means that in secondary succession, there was already a habitat where community was thriving, and that community was disturbed because of natural events like forest fire or severe cyclone, or because of human activities like pollution. And because of these reasons, that community which was existing there has now been disturbed. Fine. So can you please tell me, can we say that secondary succession will be more faster than primary succession? Can we say that? Yes, we can. Why? Because for primary succession to occur, we have discussed that primary succession occurs on a lifeless habitat, barren ecosystem or barren habitat is there. That barren habitat need to be made superior for living, and that takes time. But in secondary succession, on that habitat, life was already there. That means conditions were more suitable for the secondary succession habitat, and that's why the secondary succession will be faster than primary succession. Fine. So these are the two types of succession, ecological successions. But again, there are two more terms that are associated with succession. You can note down those terms. First, in box you can write, in a separate box you can write first term, autogenic succession. Autogenic, AUTOGENIC, autogenic succession. What is atogenic succession? See, as you have raised that particular doubt, sir, how climate can play a role in succession, right? So if a succession is driven by biotic factors, if a succession is driven by biotic factors, then that succession is atogenic succession. For example, if there is excessive feeding up of trophic level 2 by trophic level 3, then that particular trophic level 2 will wipe out eventually. And as trophic level 2 is wiped out, or as trophic level 2 has gone extinct, the subsequent trophic levels will not be able to live. That means eventually they will also die, and that habitat may become lifeless, or that habitat may lead to changes in the species. The existing species may be replaced by new species because of the activities of biotic component, and that succession is called as atogenic succession. Second is allogenic, allogenic, allogenic succession. And this is the type of succession which is driven by abiotic components like climate change, naturally occurring climate change. Fine. So this is also one of the roles, or this is the way how ecosystem operates. The biotic components of the ecosystem are in flux. They are mobile. They keep on changing. It is not that abiotic components are fixed. They also change, but they take centuries to change, or they take thousands of the years to change themselves. Fine. Next is homeostasis. Homeostasis. So what is homeostasis? See, every habitat or every ecosystem tries to maintain its balance. Though there may be external pressure, every ecosystem will try to handle that particular pressure and will try to maintain its equilibrium. Fine. For example, let us take example of locust. So during the locust attack, there was there was increase in the number of grasshoppers, right? And those grasshoppers were feeding on the green plants or green grasses, whatever green they were able to see, they were feeding on that particular thing. Fine. But what has happened now? Imagine a ecological pyramid. At the base of this ecological pyramid, we have grasses. Second trophic level is occupied by grasshoppers, then frogs, then eagle, etc. Fine. So 4 trophic levels are there: grasses, grasshoppers, frogs, and eagles. Fine. And because of locust attack, what has happened? The trophic level 2, or the number of individuals living in the trophic level 2, has increased drastically. But the trophic level 1 is constant. The amount of food for that particular trophic 2 is constant. It has not changed. And that's why eventually what will happen? Eventually, the increased number of grasshoppers will not be able to get their food resources, and that's why they will die eventually. Fine. So this is a self-regulation which is carried out by every ecosystem. Every ecosystem tries to maintain its equilibrium through self-regulation. And this ability or this capacity of ecosystems to maintain their equilibrium through self-regulation is known as homeostasis. Fine. So it is nothing but an ability of ecosystem to maintain equilibrium through self-regulation. But it is not that this capacity of ecosystems is infinite. No, it is not infinite capacity. Every ecosystem has certain limitations. If we are burdening a particular habitat with a high amount of pollution or high water pollution, then eventually that ecosystem will not be able to sustain that pressure and it will eventually give up. So the ability of homeostasis is not infinite, it is limited. And if it is tested to an extent, it will break. Fine. So what are the factors because of which we can say that the ecosystem may lose equilibrium? So those factors can be natural factors like forest fires or cyclones or even earthquakes, volcanic activities, etc. So naturally, an ecosystem may lose its equilibrium. For example, the forest fires of Australia. The forest fires of 2020 were extremely severe, and because of that, the habitat, the bush forest of Australia, which was the habitat for koalas and kangaroos, was destructed. And because of that, those koalas and kangaroos were compelled to shift to other habitats. Fine. So homeostasis is not infinite ability, it is limited ability of the ecosystem. So that is the natural reason. Even we can disturb, human beings can disturb the natural balance of ecosystem through various activities like exploitation of the resources in excessive amounts. So if we are using a particular or if we are using plant species and we are carrying out deforestation, then again it is not sustainable. Ecosystem will give means will not be able to withstand in that particular pressure. When again, one more reason for homeostasis or to disturb homeostasis is introduction of alien species or invasive species. If a particular habitat is not meant for certain species, and if that species is introduced in that habitat, then that species may wipe out naturally occurring plant species or animal species eventually by using the resources available in that particular habitat and by depriving the naturally occurring organisms from those resources. Right? So even alien or invasive species may disturb the homeostatic ability of the ecosystem. Fine. So so this is about our lecture today. But I want you to write certain terms. So please make a box. In that box, we'll be writing certain important terms. So there is question. Can you please give an example of autogenic succession? Autogenic succession example can be in invasive species. Invasive species can be the example of autogenic succession. For example, if we have introduced a grass which is not familiar to Nilgiris, and if that grass is using up the resources available in Nilgiris biosphere reserve excessive in an excessive amount, then we can say that the resources will be means the naturally occurring species of plants and animals will not be able to use those resources because of the invasive grass species, right? Human intervention can be an example too of atogenic. Yes, yes, yes. In the beginning only, I have mentioned that even human intervention in the form of excessive use of resources of or pollution can be considered as atogenic success. Yes, fine. So now please make a box. In that box, we'll be writing certain important terms. First is ecotone. Ecotone. So what is ecotone? Ecotone is a transitional zone between two ecosystems. Ecotone is a transitional zone between two ecosystems. For example, can you give me any example of ecotone? So it is a transitional zone between two ecosystems. Can you give any example of ecotone? Can you think of any example? A zone which is a transitional between, suppose, land and water. Continental shelf. Continental shelf. Fine. Continental shelf. Yes, you can say, but you should not go too deep. This initial part of continental shelf can be considered as a ecotone, right? Or to be more specific, estuaries. Estuaries are an example of ecotone, right? Because estuaries is the habitat where fresh water is giving way to saline or marine water, right? So the water present in the estuaries is brackish water. It is neither fresh, it is not saline water. It is brackish water, right? Even desert, oh sorry, even grassland, not desert, grasslands are considered as ecotone between forest and desert. Like why we can say that grasslands are ecotone? Because in grasslands, conditions are not too favorable to qualify as a forest biome or forest ecosystem, nor they are too what we say too drastic to qualify as a desert ecosystem. It is a transition between forest and desert, and that's why grasslands are also considered as ecotone. Fine. So examples: estuaries and grasslands you can write. Next point, under ecotone only you can write. In ecotone, conditions are intermediate to the adjacent ecosystems. That's why it is also known as a zone of tension. For example, let us take example of estuaries. See, estuaries, we generally associate estuaries with mangroves, right? And mangroves are not an ordinary kind of vegetation. In order to survive in that brackish water environment, they need to exhibit different kinds of adaptabilities, like salt secreting leaves. They have to remove excessive amount of salt from their bodies, and that's why they should have salt secreting glands, right? So moreover, they should exhibit viviparity mode of reproduction. Why? Because it is the wetland. Estuaries are wetland. Water is there on that particular in that particular habitat everywhere. Water is the prime factor that determines the characteristic of that habitat. And if viviparity mode of reproduction is not practiced, then for a new plant, it is very difficult to survive in the harsh environment of estuaries. And that's why this zone is called as this ecotone is called as zone of tension. The conditions are not favorable. They are quite harsh conditions. Right? Next, the composition of one species. The composition of one species decreases and of other species increases. Fine. So suppose we are traveling from forest to deserts. So as we move away from forest, we will see the fall in the number of trees, and we will encounter more grasses. Fine. So one species numbers fall and other species numbers will increase. Next point, in a well-developed ecotone, some organisms are entirely different from adjoining communities. Right? So if again, you can take example of mangroves. You will not find mangroves in terrestrial ecosystem or nor in marine waters. Right? So they are especially meant for, or they are especially developed for ecotones. Right? Next point. In some ecotones, the number of species and population density, the number of species and the population density of some species is much greater than the adjacent ecosystems. This tendency of increased biodiversity, in an ecotone is called as edge effect. Edge effect. Fine. Subpoint of this subpoint, and such species is known as edge species. Edge species. Fine. So what is this point? See, there are certain species, especially of birds, which prefer conditions of ecotone. They prefer conditions of ecotone because they find ecotones safer than adjoining ecosystems or adjoining communities, and that's why they prefer ecotones for nesting and breeding purposes. And because of nesting and breeding activities by these species, their diversity, their population in that ecotone will be more than adjacent ecosystems. And that's why this effect is called as edge effect. And the species which is populating that particular ecotone more than adjoining communities, it is called as edge species. Fine. Second term in that box. First was ecotone. Second term now sere. 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 Under that, it is a temporal transition. It is a temporal transition from one stage in succession to another stage in succession. Fine. For example, suppose we have discussed about pioneer species. Fine. So from pioneer species, from lichens or from microbes, if suppose there are certain other species that are coming up in that that habitat, then this temporal transition from lichens to other species and eventually to climax community is called as sere. Fine. And one particular transition, for example, from lichens, let's say small bushes have developed. For example, from lichens, small bushes have developed. So this development of small bushes is referred to as seral. So one intermediate step in succession is called as seral. SERAL, seral. Seral. One particular intermediate step in succession is seral. Lichens to climax is sere. Yes, means the temporal transition means from lichens to small bushes to larger plants and then to climax community. This transition is called as sere. And any one specific intermediate step you are considering, then that step is seral. Fine. So complete transition is sere and one stage is seral. Fine. So we have 5-10 minutes. Can we take one more term, third term? Yes. So third term you can write, and this is important. Ecosystem services. Ecosystem services. So what are ecosystem services? So we have discussed that there are various components like biotic and abiotic, right? And those components we human beings use for various purposes. Like, for example, we get food, water, fiber, medicinal plants. We also use ecosystem for recreational purposes, right? Ecosystem also carries out water purification, air purification. It also helps in flood regulation, climate regulation, right? So these are the useful things that we get from ecosystem, and these are nothing but ecosystem services that we receive. But these ecosystem services are categorized into various types. Fine. So please write down. First point under ecosystem services. These are the benefits. These are the benefits that human beings receive. That human beings receive from ecosystem. Right? Next, there are 4 types of ecosystem services. So we'll discuss those 4 types one by one. First is provisioning services. Provisioning, provisioning services. See, these services, provisioning services, they have monetary value. For example, food material that we get, it has monetary value, right? So, for example, timber that we get from plants, it has monetary value. So, provisioning services, you can write, they have monetary value. Monetary value. For example, timber, nuts, food, and whatever you can think of which has monetary value for that particular product or service. Now, second, regulating services. Regulating. So for these kind of services, it is difficult to associate monetary value, but these are very important for our survival. We cannot associate monetary value to these services, but they are essential for survival of human beings. What kind of these services are? These are like water purification, climate regulation, right? So can we associate monetary value to water purification that we get from ecosystem? No, it is very difficult to do that. Fine. So you must have heard about green GDP. So green GDP, one of the important or one of the obstacle for measuring green GDP was how to calculate the environmental cost of economic progress. Right? And that's why China initiated it initially, but they scrapped that idea because it was very difficult for accounting of green GDP. Right? Similarly, we cannot account for climate regulations cost, and that's why they are considered as regulating services. Right? You can write, it is difficult to find monetary value. It is difficult to find monetary value for these services. For these services, but they are important for our survival. Example, climate regulation, water purification. Next, third type of service, cultural services. Cultural services. Under that, you can write, they have aesthetic. They have aesthetic or educational importance. Aesthetic or educational importance. For example, we use nature for tourism. Tourism is a recreational activity, right? So you can give example as tourism. Even research that is carried out with the help of biotic or biotic components in the nature that can also be a part of cultural service that we receive. Right? And lastly, fourth, supporting services. Supporting services. Right? These are the fundamental services that we receive from the ecosystem. Fundamental services that we receive from the ecosystem. Fine. So, can you give me any example from our today's discussion of supporting services? Nutrient cycling. Nutrient cycling is the most fundamental service that we receive from ecosystem. Without nutrient cycling, rainfall from water cycle. Acha, rainfall from water cycle. Yes, you can use that also. Rainfall, fine. Rainfall or even soil formation. Soil formation. It is the most basic fundamental service that we receive. Homeostasis. Homeostasis, can it be a service for us? Fine, yes, it can be. Means if there is a change in the ecosystem, a drastic change in the ecosystem, our survival is threatened. It will get threatened, right? So yes, homeostasis, you can call homeostasis also as a supporting service. It is the fundamental benefit that we receive from ecosystem, right? Fine. So this is about today's lecture. We'll meet tomorrow and we'll discuss tomorrow about the biomes. Fine. So thank you for your time. Tomorrow or Monday? Uh, Tomorrow is Saturday, right? So Saturday we have class. Means I'm not aware of this. I'll let you know on group. Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.